first speaker tonight is Dr. Amanda Thompson, who will discuss nutrition and public health in the Galápagos Islands. So we're going to be posting the link to her full bio and our other scientist bio in the chat. Our second speaker this evening is Dr. Diego Riveros-Iregui, and he will talk about water and land dynamics. And then our final speaker is Adrian Marchetti, who's a marine scientist, and he will discuss marine ecology and biological productivity in the Galápagos Islands.
Thank you all for being here. I have the honor of going first. So before I tell you a little bit about my research, wanted to tell you just a little bit about the center in particular. And the mission of the Center for Galapagos Studies and the Galapagos Science Center is to really bring together researchers from numerous disciplines. So everything from data science to marine sciences, animal health, human health and nutrition, demography, evolutionary biology, to look at some of the key issues addressing environments and people and animals in the Galapagos, and then expanding that knowledge outwards. So looking at human environment impacts, looking at how the social, terrestrial, and marine subsystems interact, to have discoveries of new knowledge to inspire innovation, and particularly to inspire innovation around creating sustainable global island ecosystems. And because the Galapagos are an island, they serve as what can be considered a contained laboratory, where we can have researchers really investigating the overlaps between the social, the terrestrial, and the marine systems, and examining how they work together. And that's what you're going to see tonight. So you have an example of a researcher from each of these domains. And my domain is the social domain, and looking at human health in particular. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the food and water environments on Galapagos and how they contribute to human health. And so when people think of the Galapagos Islands, they tend to think of the place where Darwin came ashore in 1835, where he saw the unique flora and fauna, like these giant tortoises, that led to his theory of evolution by natural selection, which was published in 1859. However, the islands are also home to human populations, and humans began migrating to the islands in the late 1800s and settled small farms and fishing villages. And this migration really increased in the 1980s with tourism and the rise of the tourism industry. So today, what we're looking at, because of tourism and the migration that comes along with the economic growth, we're seeing a significantly larger population. So about 25,000 people live on the 4 inhabited Galápagos Islands. Yet relatively little research has examined the impact of population growth and environmental change and economic growth on the health of the island's human residents. And so that's what we're really interested in. So we know that the population of the Galapagos has grown by over 300% in the past decade. And each year there are around 275,000 tourists who visit the island. And this really strains the existing food and water resources. About 97% of the island land is designated as national parkland, which limits the amount of food that can be grown. And that leaves residents and tourists dependent on food shipped in from the mainland, both on barges and by plane. And because the islands are about 600 miles off the coast, food that's coming in on the barges and produce that's coming in on the barges doesn't come in the freshest. And residents tend to rely on packaged foods, which they view as safer and cheaper. At the same time, water and sanitation systems really haven't been able to keep up with this increasing urbanization and demand. And so although on San Cristobal, the island that you saw in the video, water is provided by the municipality, piped into these cisterns, residents really have concerns about the quality of the water and tend to rely on purchased bottled water, like you see here, for drinking and cooking. And so our interests are how these economic changes, urbanization changes, have affected human health. And in particular, we're interested in what's called the dual burden of disease. And this is the study of the simultaneous occurrence of undernutrition, usually micronutrient undernutrition, but also stunting, which is short stature due to kind of chronic lack of energy availability or chronic infections, and how that exists at the same time as overweight and non-communicable diseases like heart disease, and diabetes. And we see these co-occurring both within individuals and within households and within communities. And like many low and middle income countries, the Galapagos has evidence of a considerable dual burden of disease. So data collected by a nationally representative study in 2012 found that on the islands, still over 10% of children were stunted, which is considered an indication of chronic undernutrition. And micronutrient deficiencies, particularly those of iron and zinc, were common in children and reproductive aged women. But at the same time, the prevalence of overweight and cardiometabolic diseases are among the highest in Ecuador on the islands. And so over 40% of children and over 75% of adults are overweight and obese. And so the research that we've been focusing on recently is looking at how this burden of disease may be associated with the water and food resources available on the island. And so working with colleagues at the University of San Francisco, Quito, we developed the Healthy Family Study, which is looking at water and food access, security, and quality, so both individually and then the joint exposure to poor water and food environments, and how that contributes to this dual burden of infection and undernutrition, as well as non-communicable diseases and overweight. And what we're adding to this question is something that we find unique, and other people found unique too, was psychological distress. So looking at whether, for example, having concerns about water quality or concerns about water availability contribute to anxiety or depression in mothers, which has implications for both her health and the health of her children. And so when we look at the food environment on the islands, what we see is that about 40% of households have at least mild food insecurity. And this is defined as not having access to sufficient quantities of culturally appropriate foods. And as one of our participants described, this is really linked to the island setting. Well, it's not because we don't have enough for us specifically. It's just that sometimes there's not enough on Galapagos. There was a time when all the food on the boats went bad, so there were no fruits and there were no veggies, so we could only get onion, tomato, and there's no variety. When there are boats, there's enough of everything, but when there's not, it's bad. And what we also see is that the distribution of food isn't equal across the islands either. So we mapped the location of markets and food vendors and estimated the proportion of food that was on the shelves. So it was from 0% in red to 100% in green. And this was in between the barge shipments. So it was about 3 weeks since the last barge had come. And you can see that the majority of food is concentrated down here along the coast where the tourists stay. And there's less food sort of readily available as you go up into the neighborhoods where residents live. And there's some variability up in this corner here, but this is the hospital for the island. And this tends to be a slightly more affluent neighborhood. So we see both tourism as well as income inequalities affecting access to food. When we turn to the water environment, we see that the majority of households, and in fact 2/3 of households, rate their water quality as fair to good. But at the same time, over 50% of households purchase bottled water, and almost half of households treat their water either through filtering or boiling before they drink it. As one of the residents describes, I think that one of the biggest problems here on the islands are the illnesses related to poor water quality. Although we know that we have potable water, that the water is clean when it leaves the treatment plant, nonetheless, there are still problems with the pipes. And because of this concern about quality, residents tend to rely on bottled water for drinking and cooking, which represents a considerable expense. So in our family, we pay $40 a month for bottled water, which is a large part of my salary. And although overall water insecurity scores were quite low, we do see that a sizable proportion of the households that we interviewed reported feeling upset about their water situation, drinking water that looked, tasted, or smelled bad, or having concerns that they don't have enough money to pay for water. And then we also have evidence that water and food insecurity are clustering together in households. So when we looked at the presence of water and food insecurity, we saw that over 1/3 of households were dealing with both limitations, and only 17% of households were dealing with neither. And this had a significant impact on their health. So when we looked at the presence of the dual burden within households, we found that households that were suffering from both water and food insecurity, about 90% of them were suffering from the dual burden as well, compared to about 75% of households with no water or food concerns. Now, that's still a really high number, 75%, but it is significantly higher in those who are dealing with water and food limitations. We also see that water and food insecurity, both individually and jointly, are associated with mental health distress, and that's a composite measure of depression, anxiety, and or stress. And so individuals who have both water and food insecurity are almost 3 times as likely to suffer from mental health distress than those who have neither limitation. So what we think we see evidence for, what we do see evidence for here on the island, is what we're calling the triple burden of disease. So that we see high levels of overweight and non-communicable diseases persisting alongside undernutrition and infectious diseases, contributing to a dual burden of disease, which is what we expected. But we also have not insignificant levels of distress, which is contributing, particularly for women, 1 out of 5 women, into a triple burden of disease. And these analyses suggest that we really need to understand the social and behavioral factors that link individuals' mental and physical health to their water and food environments to be able to improve health of residents on the island. So thank you for listening, and thank you to our fantastic team who makes this research possible.
Okay, so I'm Diego Riveros-Iregui. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Geography, and I am a hydrologist. So this is a great transition here from what Amanda was talking about. We study water and land use dynamics in the Galápagos Islands. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the work that we're doing in Galápagos. So we know that islands are these really tiny dots in the middle of the ocean. So lots of seawater, lots of salt water, but islands are these tiny sponges, some of them, that are capable of maintaining a freshwater supply. So we know that in Galapagos there are different environments. So this picture is from the eastern side of San Cristobal Island. It looks green. You see the vegetation. It's really green on this side up in higher elevation. But if you go to other islands in the archipelago, like here, Isabella, this is a group of Carolina students that traveled with me in 2016. You think that you are in somewhere on Mars, perhaps, because there's no soil, there's no vegetation, and there's very little water. So the question is, where does fresh water come from in tropical islands? And we know that water, fresh water in particular, is the reason why some islands are capable of sustaining human settlements and so on. So human settlements as well as animals. Some animals require fresh water as well as plants. As Amanda mentioned, 25 people live in the Galapagos Islands, but an order of magnitude more visit the Galapagos every year. Of course, this is pre-COVID, but these numbers are significant. So the answer is the sky, same as in continents. So the water comes from the sky and from this very basic phenomenon. Air masses move up in elevation. They're forced up because of the shape of the islands until they form clouds. There's condensation in the clouds, and then there's precipitation. But we also know that for some tropical environments, there's another form of precipitation that is very important, and that is fog. So there's condensation in the cloud, but it is not quite enough to cause precipitation. So here are 3 images of the same site with different degrees of fogginess. So we know that fogginess can be up to 25% of the annual input of water. So it really represents a very significant input of water in many tropical systems and coastal systems as well. So we know that plants play a very important role in capturing some of that moisture. And this picture to the right comes from a really high elevation site in Colombia. This is not Galapagos, but I want to show you this leaf because it's covered in this hair-like structure. called plant pubescence. That picture to the left shows this structure that helps the leaf condense some of that water and capture some of that water, strip some of that moisture from the cloud. And we also know that these leaf hairs help the plant regulate leaf temperature as well as different physiological processes. And something interesting that we learned recently when Charles Darwin was returning to England, 1836, he stopped at an island called Ascension Island, which is a really tiny rock, almost equidistant between South America and Africa. And what they noticed was that the island was immersed in the cloud, but there was no surface water. So Darwin says the island was entirely devoid of trees. So Darwin and some colleagues had the idea of alter the local hydrology by planting non-native trees, so bring plants essentially, so that plants would remove some of that moisture from the clouds. And the result is that it worked, and they were able to have some condensation, but at the same time, they changed the entire landscape of Ascension Island. Ascension Island now claims to have the only man-made cloud forest in the world. So, but let's go back to Galapagos and let's talk about this interesting debate that occurred in Galapagos a few years ago between tortoises and goats. So tortoises, this is one of the classic photos from Lantin, from Galapagos. Tortoises would go up to the highlands and they would wait for this slow fog drip to occur, and they would collect moisture, drink some of that fresh water from the moisture. But when humans brought goats to the islands, goats decimated the vegetation to the point that tortoises wouldn't find fresh water. And that drove the largest ever eradication project of island invasive mammals. So if you have time tonight, I highly recommend you go to Google and Google Radiolab Galapagos goats. There's a Radiolab from 2014. Really, really interesting Radiolab about the eradication of all the goats because they were eating the vegetation for the tortoises. So essentially, that's what my group and I do. We study the importance of fog to the water budget. We know that fog is more important in high elevations of the islands. It doesn't occur in all islands because of the elevation. And the high elevation of San Cristobal looks like this, very dense, pretty much like a tropical montane cloud forest, whereas the low elevation has more arid type vegetation. There's also another threat to this with regards to climate change, and that is a hypothesis called cloud lifting. And it's the idea that with a warmer atmosphere, the atmosphere will expand and the clouds will be pushed higher and higher in elevation with the expansion of the atmosphere. So that will cause these clouds to move up, and the ecosystem that was immersed in the cloud to be below the cloud. So this is an active area of research. There's a lot of interest in this phenomenon, particularly in tropical environments. So our research in Galapagos focuses on monitoring environmental variables, a lot of variables that have to do with how much water comes to the ecosystem. We install these fog type collectors, which are essentially cylindrical meshes that allow fog to condense. And through a funnel, we can quantify how much fog drip or fog condensation occurs. We install sensors in the soil that allow us to measure the dynamics of soil moisture during rainfall, also during fog events. We take many of these samples to the lab and analyze the chemical composition of these samples. And we also take students from Carolina and teach them and give them opportunities to conduct hands-on research. I'm going to show you just a couple of examples here of 3 different variables, including precipitation, air temperature, and relative humidity. And the dark blue is the windward side of the island, and the light blue is the leeward side of the island. And we see clear differences in the amount of rainfall that it falls in just over 6 months, so more than twice the amount of rainfall. see differences in temperature as well as differences in relative humidity. If you look at relative humidity on the windward side of the island, completely saturated pretty much for 6 months of the year. So this has a lot of implications for plants like this plant that establishes relationships with mosses growing off the plants. And we know something interesting as well is that the chemical composition, the isotopic composition of the fog is slightly different from the isotopic composition of rainfall. So we can use these differences to track the water through the ecosystem and see what type of water plants are using and what type of water native plants are using with relation to invasive plants. Like in this case, this is a guava plant that is using a lot of fog because of all the mosses that grow on the branches. And we track this signature, this chemical signature of fog through what we call the critical zone. So essentially the top layer of the earth where plants interact with soil, with water, and with the rock. And this is essentially our larger question. So looking at these dynamics of cloud water interception, what comes into the soil, what portion of that moisture is evaporated and then eventually recycled into more precipitation.
So I am the third member of this group here. My name is Adrian Marchetti, and I am an associate professor here in marine sciences at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. So thank you for joining us this evening. I'm also the research director of marine ecology and oceanography within the Center for Galapagos Studies. And it's my honor to share with you some of the research that members of my department have been working on in the Galapagos since 2014. And not only does this include faculty such as myself, there's a physical oceanographer, Dr. Harvey Seam, and a microbial ecologist, Dr. Scott Gifford, but quite a few of our students as well have participated in these in this project. And as you can imagine, being an island nation, the folks that live in the Galapagos are very dependent on their marine resources. Not only is it a source of income in relation to tourism, there's people that come from all over the planet to dive within the waters of the Galapagos, but also in relation to their food. A significant majority of the protein in their diet actually comes from the ocean. So as you can imagine, anything that might influence or perturb the ocean system is of great importance to these people. So in terms of the Galapagos Marine Reserve area, as you can see from this map up here, it encompasses quite a large majority of the islands and is a significant size. It's actually one of the largest marine reserves in the world. And what makes the Galapagos very unique is that it actually is at, as you can see down here, at the convergence of some major ocean currents. So whether it be from the south, where you have this cold, nutrient-rich current from the Humboldt, or from the north, where it's more of a warmer, oligotrophic current from Panama. In addition to that, there is a current, the Cromwell current, that sort of comes up to the surface from down deep and actually hits the islands and forms what we call an upwelling zone. So this again brings a lot of very cold, nutrient-rich waters to this area that actually fuels a lot of the primary productivity and a lot of the life that we see and the Galapagos is known for. In particular, those of you may know about the concept of El Nino. When we have El Nino years, there tends to be warmer winters, more snow perhaps in areas that are high in altitude. And so it really changes the global climate. And in particular, what's really interesting about the Galapagos is that they sit at the front lines of El Nino events. And so in fact, what our group was very interested in is learning in how the organisms that we study were impacted by the most recent El Nino that occurred in 2015 and 16. So in terms of the organisms we look at, we are focusing on the microorganisms. So those that really form the base of what we call these marine food webs. And my group in particular focuses on phytoplankton. So these again are sort of like the plants of the ocean, although most of them are algae and not plants. But the main role that they play is they actually are taking energy from the sun and then converting that energy into chemical energy that then allow for transfer up the food chain to the larger, more charismatic organisms that we know and love in the Galapagos. And what I'm just showing you here is that phytoplankton really come in all different shapes and sizes. So they can be very small, sort of round objects, or they can actually be quite elaborate, like we see here in some dinoflagellates and some diatoms here that are known for their glass houses that they create. So there's an incredible diversity of organisms within the phytoplankton. And again, they have two major roles. One is in how they actually contribute to the carbon cycle. So a lot of what we're looking down here are the processes that influence that transfer of carbon through these microbial loops, as you may call it, as well as how they then form food for zooplankton that then support a lot of our charismatic organisms that we know and love, like the large fish and the manta rays, the whale sharks, hammerheads, sea lions, and turtles that really bring a lot of the tourism to the Galapagos because it's quite a unique area for that. And again, all of it stems from our microscopic organisms, the phytoplankton. And so we actually participated on a series of research expeditions, as we call them. So every fall for these years here in 2014, 15, 16, and 18, we actually traveled to the Galapagos and with a collaboration of the Galapagos National Park, used their vessels to look at the oceanographic conditions all around the Galapagos. And what I want to point out here is, as you can see, this was our first year in 2014, but then in 2015, we see a lot of these reds on this map here, which is associated with warmer water conditions. And this was at sort of the peak of the El Nino that happened between 2016 and then in 2015 and 2016. And as you can see here in our 2016 year, we entered into more of a cooler area, which is more typical of this region where we have those upwelled waters that are much cooler, providing a lot of nutrients and productivity to the west side of Isabella here. So what we can focus on is our group does a lot of genomics. So we use DNA sequencing techniques to look at the diversity of these different sort of microorganisms. And in that sense, what we're trying to do is carry on the legacy of Darwin. So Darwin really focused on things like birds, the finches, obviously, as well as the tortoises and even snails to come up with his theories of natural selection. But what we're trying to do is see if we can apply those same concepts to what we're learning about the microscopic organisms. And what I'm just showing you here is just showing, looking at the relative proportions of the different organisms that we are focusing on, all these different phytoplankton. And if we look at these sort of major groups down here, we can see that there's quite a variety of different phytoplankton groups. And in particular, there's a spatial organization where, again, we see more of these diatoms that are really sort of productive and like nutrient-rich waters at stations that are more on the western part of the Galapagos, whereas on the eastern side, we see more of these dinoflagellates and chlorophyte type of organisms. So again, just sort of highlight here that this is a very biodiverse area within the microbes, and we're seeing differences between years of El Nino versus the non-El Nino. And we can even drill down further into some of these groups and really get a sense of how they're changing in response to the El Nino, which could be very important, and how, again, they transfer that energy of food up the food chain to those larger, more charismatic organisms. So just to kind of highlight here from our results, we're seeing a lot of these groups like Syndinialis, which are in 2015. And these organisms here are really interesting because they're actually parasites. So it's surprising that we see associated with warmer conditions, lower nutrient conditions during El Nino, the presence of more parasites, which really sort of has us thinking about how that might influence the food chain and the transfer of energy up the food chain. So what I really want to focus on now, though, are some of the major challenges and stresses that are influencing the marine environment in this area. And in particular, as I've mentioned before, these El Nino cycles, where it tends to be during El Nino, we see a reduction in upwelling and a warmer water conditions that are associated with those lower nutrients. And during these El Nino events, you can see that there's actually a large food shortage for a lot of the organisms that depend on the marine environment, which could have a lasting influence. But one thing that we're actually seeing with climate change is actually an increase in the intensity and frequency of these El Nino events. And so, you could, through time, there has been sort of variations in the frequency and intensity, but as it so happens, within the last 30 years or so, there's been some of the most severe El Nino events on record. So in addition to that, another very important aspect that we need to consider is invasive species. So as you know, associated with the tourism that is entering or coming into the Galapagos, there's a lot more ships that are coming to the area. And they could be going from one island to the next, transferring species in these microscopic organisms, even in the ballast water, as they sort of take up water and then release water from one area to the next. But also in relation to the macroscopic level, we're seeing organisms like these. This is a pyrosome, or also known as a sea pickle. And it's really interesting how these are also plankton. So they depend on the mercy of the currents to actually move from one place to another. But in certain areas, even particular like off the coast of California, as we're seeing our oceans increase in temperature, we're seeing more and more of these organisms. And it's quite difficult to say how they actually are influencing the food webs and the productivity of these regions. Another challenge or stress to the marine environment is pollution. And I'm sure many of you have heard about the plastic situation. The amount of plastic entering our ocean is actually increasing exponentially from one year to the next. And the Galapagos are no exception. Even though they're the most remote islands on the planet, because again, that feature of being at the convergence of major ocean currents, they tend to sort of have a lot of plastics that end up on their shores. And it's really quite interesting when you take a walk along these beaches and you're seeing plastics from Japan, from China, from all over the planet ending up on the shores of the Galapagos. And so not only is it macroplastics that are the problem, but also microplastics, where essentially they can be almost the size of plankton. And so if you're a fish, it's sometimes really hard for them to actually distinguish between what is plastic and what is actual food. Overexploitation of marine resources is also a problem. And so what we're looking at here is, you can see here, these are floats that are often created by illegal fishermen that will put these out, and then basically the fish will school around them, and they have little GPSs on them. And so if they let them float around the area for about 3 weeks, and then they come by with the GPS and they locate them, and they actually can swoop up with their nets all the fish that have gathered around them. And so this is an illegal form of fishing that the Galapagos National Park are trying to prevent. And this was actually on one of our research cruises, where we had to take the time to pull out these illegal floats as we were going through from one island to the next. And so not only is this happening on the artisanal level of the local fishermen, but also on the sort of the international level, where some of you might have heard about this large illegal fishing fleet that was caught in the Galapagos waters, where they had all of these over 10,000 carcasses of sharks found. And so again, it's a major problem because of the remoteness of the area in trying to keep tabs on all these sorts of illegal fishing activities. So I just wanted to kind of end off here by just sort of mentioning that healthy populations and ecosystems require healthy oceans. And so it's our responsibility to actually make sure that we can maintain ocean health and understand the importance of biodiversity in this area for many years to come and for many generations to come. So with that, I'd just like to acknowledge a few people that have been involved in these research expeditions, including members of my team here that went out on these cruises to collect our data. And with that, we open it up to any questions that people might have. And again, thank you for listening.